Hello everyone, welcome to the Don't Get Snowden This Summer, Protect Your Company's Data webinar. My name is Nick Cavalancia. I'm the VP of Marketing here at SpectorSoft. I do want to welcome you today. I'm joined today by Alan Schimmel. Alan is the co-founder and managing partner of the CISO Group. Alan has spent many, many years focused on the security industry, worked at a number of security software companies, and is now focused on consulting and PCI compliance. Alan, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Nick, thank you for having me. It should be an interesting webinar.
It certainly will be interesting. So before we get started, we wanted to take a moment here and address the thread that's on Spiceworks. We invited all you Spice heads to join us today, and some of you may have seen this posting, the thread, and some of you may not have not. We certainly would encourage you to participate in the thread. Apparently, it was started based on some advertising we had to promote this webinar, and some people took offense to the use of the reference to Snowden. And I at least want to address it up front. We certainly did not intend to offend anyone. We're not taking sides. We're not trying to say Snowden is good or bad. The reason for doing it was simply good marketing normally is taking advantage of something that will get some people's attention, that's topical. And in this case, we chose the Snowden story only because it represents, if you take aside the individual and the circumstances and maybe even your own, I'm going to throw in the word political for lack of a better term. Maybe Alan, maybe you can come up with a better term, but just where you are on the sides of this story, but just looking at actions, we just thought it was something where it was a good example of an individual with access to information within an organization who took that information without the organization's approval, if you will. And so we could have used, I guess, anyone else as well. So again, not intending to offend anyone. Certainly would encourage you to participate in the thread. It's obviously a living thread there on Spiceworks, and it's going to be ongoing a bit. So welcome you to participate there. Just real quickly about us. 4 things I'd like you to know about SpectorSoft. I've been around about 15 years. We're based in Florida here in the U.S. We do have more than 36,000 companies, everything from anywhere like 10 seats or so, all the way up to the Fortune 50, utilizing our solutions to detect insider threats. And we are an 8-time consecutive Inc. 500 5000 recipient. So the agenda for today that Alan and I are going to talk about is just revolving around the issue of insider threats. We talk about the reality of what's going on with insider threats today, how to best detect insider threats, how to know what it is you don't know, which is going to be one of the problems we want to kind of talk about in general throughout the deck, and then kind of look at how SpectorSoft can help. So the first thing I want to jump into is just kind of the reality of the insider threat. Every company is susceptible to them. Even the trusted, vetted employee is always a possibility. Companies go through background checks, they go through security clearances. I know that even our HR in our own company, and we're not a high-tech security-focused company, even we're doing background checks. And the trusted employee is always vetted, and they still are susceptible to participating. Alan, do you find that companies that you've been doing consulting for are doing checks, are doing security clearances? Is it more along the lines of what their function is going to be and what experience they've had in the past? What do you normally see out in the industry?
So, Nick, I think the environment has been changing over the last couple of years, and I think how much background and security checks people do is somewhat dependent on the particular position involved and the vertical that the company is in. So, for instance, companies that are dealing with the government tend to do this, obviously. Financial institutions, obviously. Other industries, it's a little bit more of an ad hoc. Nick, I want to make another important distinction on the reality of the insider threat cell. When we're talking, and I agree with you, and I appreciate that you took the time to address that thread on Spiceworks, because I read it myself.
Good.
When we're talking about the insider threat, in this particular case, or cases like where you have an employee that has taken data that he should not be, or perhaps should not be made public, what have you, we're really talking about exfiltration of confidential data. And that is one aspect of the insider threat. Another aspect of an insider threat is sort of a malicious, disgruntled employee who wants to sabotage systems. Rightfully or wrongly, he feels wronged, and that he has good reason and justification to harm his employer, and maybe he's going to do something harmful like that. And it's not always the exfiltration of data that we're talking about.
That's a good point. In some cases, I know that when we talk to customers, we'll sometimes even admittedly stretch the concept of the insider threat to include someone who's just wasting time on the internet, because and you take that kind of thing in mass, there's actually a very material amount of company time and therefore company dollars that are being wasted. And that becomes a threat to the business, although normally people think of insider threat, they think of security. So it's interesting that the other thing about the background checks and so on is, according to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, if I get this number right, I hope I do, I believe it's somewhere in the 80 percentile range. 87% is coming to mind, but I might have it wrong, where 87% of people that commit fraud have no prior history of doing anything bad. So even when companies perform anything that would be doing of a background check and so on, again, to Alan's point, depending on their position, that still really isn't an indicator of whether or not they're going to do something in the future or not. The next point here is every company being susceptible, understanding the extent of the threat is always going to be key. There was a recent study put out by Symantec and Ponyma in the case, the recent cost of a data breach survey, and they found in the U.S., you can see here, $188 a record is the average. And that gets very, very expensive. So being able to see the extent of a threat is going to be critical to basically minimize the costs involved with trying to deal with the repercussions of the threat itself. So knowing exactly what happened, and it will tell you how to know how to deal with it.
So Nick, again, if I can chime in there.
Please.
So knowing the extent of the threat is again multiple sides to that. Knowing the extent of the threat can cover how it is that an employee or an insider can perform some sort of deed, attack, or what have you that can cause you harm. Secondly, knowing the extent of the threat is understanding what your assets are. What's valuable, what's more valuable than others, and how easily reachable or exploitable they are. So understanding the value of your assets, understanding the nature of the threat, and then third, having systems in place to understand what if something was taken, what was taken. And I think we'll get into this a little later, but most of these breaches are not discovered that quickly.
No, they're not.
And we're not even sure what's actually taken until we read about it in the Guardian or something. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Perfect. That makes perfect sense. And we're going to discuss a little bit more of that in a couple of slides as well. So the Verizon puts out their data breach investigations report every year, and they just recently put out their 2013 data breach investigations report. We've put the short link over there on the right-hand side if you want to take a look at that. And in that investigations report, they talk about two kinds of threats, of course: the internal actor, the person that works within the organization, and the external actor as well. And there's in some cases, just internal only type of activities where kind of like what we've been talking about up till now. If someone who's an internal actor is doing something maybe malicious and so on. You have just the external threats. That is, you have an external hacker that's trying to hack in through some kind of open port on a firewall to get into a server or something. And then you've got kind of the combination therein of the two, where it includes malware and so on like that. Alan, what are you seeing as far as the mix of those two together, as well as them exclusively? Are you seeing more of one or the other, or both?
So I would say, the majority of attacks, of successful breaches, especially those highlighted within the Verizon report this past year, represent external-internal threats, where an external actor using some sort of malware or phishing, spear phishing, was able to exploit an internal actor, either usually unknowingly, frankly, but sometimes knowingly, to perform their dirty deed, and the breach occurs. So I would say that is the overwhelming majority.
And that's what we found, I think, even with Verizon's data, and that makes a lot of sense when you consider external forces, external actors are utilizing automated systems so that these external threats in a lot of cases become opportunistic. I always think back to the old movie War Games. I'm sort of dating myself. I think some of our audience may have seen that movie back in the 80s with Matthew Broderick, and he's using the war dialer. He's dialing every single phone number in, what was it, Glendale, California, or someplace wherever he lived. I forget now. And it's that kind of thing, but now it's IP addresses and ports, and they're just hitting every single server they can find on the web, trying to see if they can exploit something. And so, and obviously the internal actors have to be someone with a little bit more of intent if it's instigated by them in the first place. So,
sure. I mean, Nick, let me just quickly jump on that if I can. And this is borne out year after year in the Verizon data as well. Most attacks, overwhelming majority of attacks, more than 75% of attacks, are attacks that are relatively simple, low-level kinds of attacks. But they're also attacks of targets of opportunity. Many times when these external guys are looking to exploit an internal resource, it's like walking down a hallway of a hotel checking, unlocked doors. So, just being a little bit harder to break into than the next guy, oftentimes can, be the difference between being a victim and not.
Yeah, well, let's take a look at some of that data here. The first thing that I put on here is that they're getting better and you're getting worse. So if you look at the percentage of time it takes to exfiltrate data out, almost 70% of the time took within the range of seconds to hours. And in the Data Breach Investigations Report, Verizon categorized the time frames in seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months. And they categorized what percentage of time it took. So the exfiltration, now mind you, there's of course I've got to get into the system portion of the time frame that is not represented here, but just taking the data out takes seconds to hours. And you think of things like maybe even just something as simple as a USB stick, it's going to take seconds to copy data. I'm going to give a couple of examples later on where some people use cloud services and some other stuff, and it doesn't take that long to get the data out of the organization. That's up from 60% last year. So the people that are taking information out of your organization are getting better at it and doing it far more quickly. Now, on the contrast, 66%, almost two-thirds of the discoveries took months to years. So that means the amount of time it took you to figure out that it even happened. Alan even kind of touched on it. Not that fast in discovering that an insider threat took place, some kind of exfiltration of data perhaps or something. And that's actually up from 55% last year. So that's up quite a bit. I think that's a 20% gain there. And so they're getting better at taking data out, and you and I are not getting equally as better in order to detect those threats as they occur.
Right. And Nick, an important thing to remember is the longer the time frame from the time of the incident till the time of discovery, the harder it often is to put, from a forensics point of view, to understand how it happened and what happened, right, and what was taken. So it's, that's an important metric is the time of discovery from the time of event.
That's a great point, because the forensics tools normally used are going to show you a point in time, that is at the time the forensics tools are utilized, and any kind of log data is probably all you normally have to go off of to figure out what happened, and that's kind of critical in order to determine things like extent and if there's really damage or not, and so on.
I mean, if you think about it, some people, they'll keep 6 months worth of log data, but if you don't discover an event for 9 months,
yeah, you're a little hosed.
You're 3 months too late. Yeah.
Yeah. So the other notes here that I have is the external threats. That is the number of threat reports that involved an external actor, decreased by 6%, but the number of threats involving the internal actor increased 250%. So while the external threats are certainly the lion's share of the kind of threats that are out there, the internal threats are on the rise, and whether that be they're maliciously involved in doing it themselves or they're the unwitting participant, we're trying to assist here and focus in on the one that's the malicious actor of some kind that might be doing something like taking data out of your organization, might be committing fraud, might actually just accidentally lose data, but they still were the one that did it. There was an external threat and they're involved, and so on. So let's kind of continue on here real quick. Another set of surveys, one was done by, if I remember correctly, Kroll Advisory Services, and the other by Symantec. They'd asked employees if it was okay to do certain actions that would put the business at risk. And so you can see some of the stats here, transferring information to a personal device. Almost 2/3 think it's totally fine to do that. And that's without the express permission of the organization. Doesn't mean they're doing something bad. It just means now there's data up on a personal device, right? Taking corporate data when they leave. Half of people think it's totally fine to do that. And I remember reading a stat like this. It was actually even a little higher than 51%. And the kind of the stat that it hinged on was because the employee was never told by the company that there was a policy against it, or they have disapproved of it, or whatever the case was. So they just figured, since you didn't tell me it's bad, it's okay, which isn't entirely taking responsibility for your own actions, but that's part of the problem here. 42% are using source code from an old company. And you got to think of this in two ways. One is, if you worked at a company that developed software, you wouldn't want the source code you've had created in your organization leaving and going to another company, right? That's bad. The other viewpoint is somebody coming from an old company and reusing that company's source code in your company, and maybe you can kind of translate that into just proprietary information, intellectual property, whatever the case is. Bringing that from an old company into your company, that puts your company at risk, because now you're utilizing something that belongs to someone else. So that's also bad. But again, you've got a good percentage of people that think it's fine doing that. And then just flat out taking corporate intelligence is 18% of people think it's fine doing that, which I don't know how people can think that when you're hearing the word stealing in there. But that's part of it. That's kind of the reality of what's going on. Alan, does any of these numbers surprise you based on what you're seeing out in the industry?
Surprise me? No. I mean, I would think with our SpiceWorks community, as our audience today, Nick, most of them are aware of what they signed on to when they took their, when they started their jobs and their employment contract, that, company property, any kind of code you develop belongs to the company usually, and stuff like that. But one point I want to make, and it kind of goes back to the thread on this Snowden thing on SpiceWorks, is you may disagree with your employer, you may not even like your employer, but laws are laws and rules are rules, and you can make a personal decision to comply with and abide by these laws and rules or not. But at the same token, an employer has an obligation, if not to their shareholders and to their investors, to protect their intellectual property. Mm-hmm. So don't blame the employer for trying to protect, or don't blame the company to protect what's theirs. I don't want to get into the whole Snowden thing and the government and all that. I'm talking about private industries and their intellectual property. That, someone is investing their retirement fund in that company. Someone is invested millions of dollars in these companies, and they have an obligation to protect that property and to use solutions like a SpectorSoft or Spectre 360 to try to protect that property. So, to blame someone for protecting their property, we could get into the whole Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin thing, but let's not go there either. Yeah. They have an obligation to protect it.
Yeah, let's take a look at at a couple of examples of where companies have been impacted, and then maybe talk about them a little bit. And I've given them some just some kind of tongue-in-cheek names so that we can discuss them a little bit. And the first one is called the Three Stooges, and this is where there was a law firm where 3 employees simultaneously quit. And this is the first time I've ever seen this, at least in the news. Maybe some of you have seen this before. I just hadn't seen this. I was really kind of shocked. My jaw dropped. So before they left, they set up a Dropbox account, and they tied it over to a bunch of corporate data. So they, in essence, copied 78,000 files, 78,000, not just one little folder, 78,000 files out to a Dropbox folder. But it gets worse than that. Not only did they basically utilized that data once it had been copied out. They actually kept it bidirectionally copying, and they sabotaged data without the company knowing, and then let it copy back in, so the company was working on bad data. So, we always talk about insider threats, and on the outer lying fringes is always this data corruption, data deletion kind of an angle. I just never seen it before. Alan, have you seen anything like that where someone is just intentionally
that is exactly what I was talking about by sabotage. Right? This is not just I'm taking data that I'm going to sell to a newspaper or sell to a competitor or make public. This is I am going to sabotage the company by putting, replacing good data with bad data, or doing something to the machinery, or doing, it's sabotage. And in my mind, this is a case of industrial sabotage.
Yeah, it's a pretty heinous stuff there. The next one I call the expert spearfisher. And Alan, you actually talked about spearfishing a little bit. This is obviously when something's very targeted. There's phishing and then there's spearfishing. Spearfishing is far more targeted. This was actually done by Chinese hackers. And if you look at the screenshot there, you see this employee benefits and overhead adjustment keys.pdf file. Well, actually what there is, what you're missing, you see there's an ellipsis at the end of the file name. There's actually another 119 spaces in the file name until you get to the real exe extension. And so what they did was they actually modified even the file so that it would show up with a, I'm not going to call it a preview, but the icon there is a PDF icon, but it's actually an executable that was a custom backdoor application that they used to gain remote access and having backdoor access to a machine. And this is the reality as well. Where are people going? What emails are they opening up? This even ties into when employees are given access to their own personal email while at work. And someone might send this to a personal account. I know myself.
But it's not only email, Nick. A lot of these spear phishing attacks with attachments, they come through Twitter and Facebook.
That's I was about to actually bring that up. I've been getting emails that as I've looked at where they've coming from, because they come from like my brother, my nephew, my Aunt Patty, literally, and I've had this over a period of 6 months to a year, and it came from Facebook, which means that somebody somewhere, when you give them access to your Facebook profile saying you can access my address book and so on and so forth, they're just grabbing the names, and then either that company or they're selling it to another company, but somehow they're getting that and they're sending me emails as if it's from, like my mom called me, I got an email from Tom, that's my brother. And
right.
Should I open it? No, that's somebody phishing. They're trying to see.
Not really from Tom. Well, Nick, there's two vectors on this you got to be careful for. Number one is this is the perfect example of why you should not accept friend requests on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or any of the social media networks from people you don't know. Because what happens is now all of a sudden I became your friend, and I may post some innocuous things on your timeline or what have you, and you say, oh, yeah, I don't know, I'm not exactly sure who that guy is, but I've seen him before. And the next thing you know, I post something that says, hey, this was really great. Check this out. It's unbelievable. And it's a link, and it looks just like this link, and boom, you're done. The second thing that happens is sort of what you alluded to, is someone hijacks a friend or relative's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn account, and starts, sending you stuff, and so it appears to be coming from Brother Tom, and in fact, it does come from Brother Tom's account, but Brother Tom's account has been hacked, and you click on it, not knowing any better, and boom, you're the next victim.
And bringing this back into the insider, though, bringing this back to the company side, what makes this dangerous is all these kinds of things that you and I are talking about. If people are allowed, because employees today are blending home and work. I mean, how many times have you? When's the last employee that you've ever met that isn't checking their Facebook or checking their email or doing something personal during work time? Either on their computer or on their smartphone or something. These kind of things are then seeping into the corporate world. Basically with hackers hoping that you're basically getting access to a company computer as opposed to a home computer.
Yep.
The next one is called what I call the expressive fraudsters, and this is a Tampa woman that she stole $2.2 million worth of Amex gift cards and gift checks. Now the shocking part was she did this over a period of 10 years. So if you do the math, it's something like, I think I calculated it was like 17 grand a month or something. That's a tremendous amount of money over a tremendous amount of time that somebody can be committing that much fraud and no one ever checked. No one ever, triggered any kind of alarm at all. $2.2 million worth of American Express gift cards and checks. So it's kind of shame on the accounting department, but maybe they had a good reason for saying it was for marketing events or something like that. So that's just an example of someone committing fraud. Maybe they use their computer to order them and so on. And then the last one is just called the trusted but disgruntled insider. In fact, Alan, you even brought that up a little bit. And there's an example of an admin at the Swiss intelligence agency, NDB, and that person took on big physical hard drives, took terabytes of classified information with them. And so it's not unlike other cases that we've seen. And I chose to put this up as my screenshot. This is a new device called a thin card that it just came out a little bit ago. It's a USB-based device, and you see how small it is. That device right there holds 2 terabytes of storage. And it's that small. Wow. So we no longer need a hard drive or even a laptop-size hard drive with a USB cable. It can be that small, hidden on your person. Put it inside your belt. Someone scans your belt for the belt metal detector or whatever, and you're out. It doesn't take much. So there's some real-world examples of where these kinds of things have happened. Now, the next question becomes, how should you then detect insider threats? And so I've come up with a bunch of kind of questions that need to be asked that are the things that are going to help you decide how to detect them. The first question is, who? And who should you be watching? And Alan, I'll even kind of maybe even let you answer some of these questions just from your own standpoint, so that it's not just my biased opinion. But who should our audience be watching if they're trying to detect insider threats?
So who should we be watching? Nick, the obvious answer is everyone, but sometimes in a large organization that's easier said than done.
Not cost effective either.
Anyone with access to sensitive data, to confidential data, that usually includes executives, believe it or not.
Sure.
It can include people in departments such as finance, or where confidential, perhaps customer data is kept. And another part, and I'm sorry to say this to all my Spicehead friends out there, is the IT department. Because the IT guys in many organizations, Nick, run roughshod over the network. They have no limits. They have admin privileges to just about everything on the network, and that doesn't have to be so, frankly. And best practices will tell you not to do that. But I'd love to hear from our audience out there who are IT pros. How many of you have full admin access to the entire network and the servers on it? And and absolute power corrupts absolutely, Nick.
That's a good point. I think that in a lot of cases, though, you take organizations like in healthcare and the healthcare information management systems, medical records apps, they'll have their own security in place to make sure that somebody doesn't have access to it. Same thing with maybe HR systems. Maybe that's another good reason for adopting cloud-based services for those exact same reasons. But that also then, that actually leads into the next question, which is, what should you be watching? It's one thing to watch who, but if I watch all the people that are what I'll call the high-risk individuals, the people with access to information, and watch every single thing that they do, a lot of that's just going to be benign information. There's not a whole lot of anything that, they open up email and respond to their boss, and who cares, right? But it's the what should we be watching in terms of what gets stolen, or what's being leaked, or what's being lost if they're copying over to a stick and then the stick gets lost or something like that. Alan, what should our audience be looking for if they're trying to detect insider threats? Is there a specific kind of data set they should be watching for?
Sure. So with insider threats, there's data that I call is sort of compliance-driven protected data, and so Nick, that's personal health information, as you mentioned, for HIPAA purposes, or perhaps cardholder data environments in the PCI world, financial, information, because there's, a whole plethora of different financial regulations. And those are relatively common sense, right? Obviously, there are
Yep.
laws that say you got to protect this information. You protect that information.
Intellectual property as well, design
So
documents.
so now we go to what are the crown jewels? Think about, I always tell my customers and people I consult with, that is, think about, what about if this information were made public or given to your biggest competitor, would it hurt you? Would you be embarrassed? Would you suffer financial loss? If the answer is absolutely yes, you've got to protect that data. And that usually does cover intellectual property, business methods, customer data. Again, just customer information. Think about, if your biggest competitor was able to get your customer list and solicit them. I mean, that'd be
bad.
Pretty valuable. Yep.
Indeed. So the next question would be when. And when is more along the lines of, when is it acceptable to detect an insider threat? I already covered a little bit of the Verizon data showing that it's months to years. This aligns, almost perfectly with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, where the median amount of time it takes to detect fraud is 18 months. So they're right there in months to years, right? So, when is going to be the appropriate, ability to detect a threat?
So, Nick, the examples you give in the Verizon data and the other report are, when was the breach discovered?
Right.
The threat, if we're going to discover the threat, you need to be more proactive, right? Once we've identified who and what, when can happen at any time, and my advice is don't sit there on your hands waiting for when, right? Be proactive about when.
There are going to be leading indicators, sure. That makes good sense because you take even just a simple example of, let's say, someone who's thinking of leaving the organization. Let's consider that person a threat because they may have, let's say they're in sales. They have access to sales information, and back to your example of what if that got into your competitor's hands, therefore you want to protect it, and that person can become a threat to the organization. There might be leading indicators where they're looking on job sites or they're putting out a resume or whatever the case is. So,
and I've had customers who actually look at it, especially in the broker world. But, Nick, I don't think anyone takes solace. I've never heard anyone say, well, I feel pretty good because I discovered this breach in 13 months instead of the 18 months average. So I'm ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Indeed.
That doesn't buy you many points in the executive office.
Not at all. So the next one is how. And if you're looking at this reactively, you would be asking questions like, well, how did it happen? Like there was a breach of data with Telstra. It's a telecom company in Australia. And basically they had a bunch of customer data posted up on the web. So that was the breach. And I remember reading the article and reading from, I think it was a CEO or someone was saying, we had crews working on this for 48 hours trying to determine, how it happened. And they don't know, how it's going to happen. And that's kind of the problem here is that you're never going to know. We'll talk about a couple solutions in this slide or so that are going to help block, and or identify and alert you to some of the more common ways, but you're not always exactly sure how. I'm going to jump ahead to even why, and why is kind of the big one here. It's why did it happen? And that's, by the way, just kind of jumping back to Snowden for a moment. I think that's why we really hit a nerve with folks, which was unintended, but we hit a nerve because the reason why people are so passionate about what's going on there is the reasons behind him performing that action. But in a regular corporate environment where we're a little more dispassionate about the actions of an individual, we're just looking at someone who's maybe taking copies of their customers out when they leave to go to the next organization so they can solicit them. Trying to determine why is going to also help you establish the extent of a breach because you're going to figure out, well, what would they have wanted to take? You're trying to get into the mindset of the insider themselves. And then the last one, I think, Alan, really you kind of even touched on, which is, I was thinking about the data breach itself, and you were talking about the insider threat, the threat person, or the person being the threat, is the where, meaning where were the signs. And that all kind of ties together. So when you're trying to detect the insider threats, there's all kinds of questions that have to be answered here. And, and Alan, you almost kind of went down the path a couple moments back when you were, I think you were kind of talking about the fraud triangle. And you mentioned motivation and opportunity and rationalization a little bit. And those are part of the fraud triangle where someone is, they're motivated, they've got some kind of issue going on maybe at home, they've got a gambling problem or something or other, whatever the case is, an opportunity because they have access to data, and they can rationalize it away. You know, the company owes me. I never got a raise in the last 5 years. I'm due. I'm going to go ahead and do this anyways. And they rationalize that stuff away. And so those kind of signs that can occur before, well before they even actually perform some kind of malicious act.
Sure. Absolutely, Nick. You know, putting your feet into someone else's shoes to understand their motivation is, you know, talk to any police detectives. They'll tell you it's not an easy thing. You don't know, you know, until oftentimes it's too late, really what is driving a person to do something.
So then that's kind of the goal here, is then to get in their head. And I like that. That's kind of the thinking here. If you want to detect an insider threat to your business, you have to get in the head of the insiders and figure out which one's a threat. So, you know, what should you use? And I've got two solutions up here that are well known in the industry. You have DLP. And Alan, I'll kind of pose this to you. You know, when someone's trying to detect an insider threat, we all know that DLP is going to allow an organization to classify data based on the contents of the data itself, whether it's like a social security number or it's a credit card number, or, you know, whatever the case is, and then identify who's allowed to access that data, and then what mediums are they allowed to go ahead and utilize that data on. You know, how
Nick,
well
let me sum up the DLP. Wow, it sounds great. If only we can if only the promise of it, or if only the reality of it lived up to the promise of it. And you and I, Nick, have done webinars on this before. You know, making DLP work is a lot easier than just uttering those 3 letters. Ultimately, though, what is the aim of DLP? I want to stop the exfiltration of data that I do not want to, you know, leave my premises. And that's a very noble and worthy goal, and DLP provides some of the means of achieving that goal. In and of itself, though, it can be difficult and frankly inadequate. And so if that's all you're doing, you're not doing enough, but it's definitely something you could be doing.
Yeah, so I look at DLP from the standpoint of trying to get into someone's head, more of being more proactive, because part of that process of implementing DLP, of course, is saying, well, let's see, Fred is an accounting person, so Fred should have access to these data sets. And so in some ways, you're at least identifying which data they should access. And then the benefit of that is, of course, then you're minimizing that person's exposure to other data sets they shouldn't have access to.
And that's right. So, Nick, but I think what you just described is what I call identity and access control. And, you know, today using network access control and Active Directory and technologies like that, that's exactly what we do. Nick is in the marketing department, so therefore Nick will have access to all of my marketing resources. But Nick is not going to have access to my HR resources or my financial resources or what have you. And so I don't know if that's a function of DLP, but that's certainly classic identity and access control. And
which ties in, yeah,
far too many organizations, and again, I'd be interested to see what the audience says, far too many organizations run what we call a flat network, where basically once you're on to the whole thing. There's no gates, there's no limits, there's no, you know, group access or, you know, individual access. Once we know Nick is Nick, Nick can go anywhere. And that's a problem. But that's not DLP, that's identity and access control.
Which is a good example, because it's something I left off the slides. I'm glad you bring it up. The second one that I've got up here is just SIM, and this is more reactive. This is, of course, is taking logs from disparate systems and pulling it all together, using analytics to try and figure out what it is that someone's doing. In essence, trying to paint a picture, because they accessed some data from an application based on the logs, but then they went over to you know, let's say to the internet, and they went ahead and sent something via FTP, and they're using different log systems to try and establish what someone's doing. And that's one way of detecting. It's, of course, reactive detection, but in some cases the threat has to rear its ugly head by rearing its ugly head by actually performing the action before you're ever going to be able to detect it in the first place. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, we've got SIM, we've got DLP, you mentioned IAM. Alan, are we missing anything else on the list?
Let me just quickly say something about SIM, Nick.
Sure.
I don't want to say too much because my mom always told me if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it. But that being said, you know, SIM to me is the perfect example of the technology that we use and we raise our hand and say, hey, we discovered it in 13 months rather than 18 months. It is totally reactive, and most SIM products, frankly, are so complex. By the time they're set up and the time they're working and the time you're actually monitoring them, they're really not a tool to detect insider threat. So they're not an effective tool to detect an insider threat. They can be a tool to detect a breach after the fact, right, to do some forensics.
Sure.
But then, I mean, it's just not real time enough there.
No, that's a good point, and part of the challenge here with any of these kinds of solutions that we've talked about, whether it's DLP or SIM, maybe the closer one is something like IAM, but the challenge here is that all these kinds of systems are data centric. IAM is, of course, really not, but the other ones they're data centric, and that becomes part of the challenge when you try to detect an insider threat. And I always say that people should stop watching the things that an employee interacts with and actually just start watching the employee themselves. Because if you're watching the things an employee interacts with, the data, with systems, with the internet, with the network, with servers, applications, you're going to miss something because you're trying to watch everything that they interact with. What happens if you don't see, if you're not logging, or there maybe isn't a log, for something that the employee decides to interact with as a means of exfiltrating information or committing fraud or whatever the case is, then you're never going to see it. So let me kind of just talk a little bit about monitoring the employee instead and watching them. And we do that through something that we call user activity monitoring. And what you're basically doing here, and it's a little different than other systems because you're watching the employee themselves, you're getting a comprehensive view into all of their activity on their work computer, whether it's an individual or the entire company or something in between. Now, there's three parts to it. First one is it records everything the user does. And you have to kind of think tactically here. You have to think of what you and I do on a daily basis on a computer. We'll write emails, we'll type keystrokes, we'll use applications, we'll go on the internet, and maybe we'll do some chatting, we'll print things, we'll copy things, we'll delete things, and you record those activities. And then what happens is that it creates a lot of information, so we want to be able to be alerted to things that are anomalous. And so there's both keyword-based and activity-based notifications, so that if I trigger, using my example of maybe someone's a flight risk because they're leaving the company in sales and we're worried about them maybe taking information, we might look for keywords like resume or dice.com or monster.com or something, or activities like maybe they print more than 50 documents in a day. And that would be a trigger that you can go, there might be something wrong, there's some anomalous behavior here. And then the last part is being able to review that data in aggregate so that you get some context around what they're doing and be actually able to play back. Much like a videotape. I'll show this in a minute or two doing a quick demonstration, but play this information back like a video and be able to see what it was the employee did and see how those questions, you know, the who, what, when, why, how, where, all those kind of things all get answered by watching what the employee does. Now,
hey, Nick, if I can jump in 1 second,
sure.
I just happened to notice, though, that some folks in the audience weren't really clear in what we meant by DLP and SIM. So it's hard to compare user activity monitoring to DLP and SIM if you don't know what DLP and SIM is or what we mean by those acronyms. So just real quickly, guys, DLP is data loss prevention, or sometimes called data leak prevention. And it's usually a technology whereby you set up, you designate certain data that cannot be copied or moved or you remove from the network. And SIM, right, is Security Event and Information Managers. And basically, SIMs usually sit on top of other security technologies such as firewalls, IDS, IPS, a vulnerability manager, DLP, etc. And they monitor and try to correlate security incidents and events. So I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate that, Alan. I don't have the visibility into that screen, so I appreciate you taking a look and keeping abreast of what's going on out in the audience. So
Okay.
well, you've got these two kinds of solutions that we've mentioned, and then Alan also mentioned identity and access management, which in essence is a way of trying to define who an individual is, not just because they logged in with a set of credentials, but the two-factor authentication, or it's a meta directory of some kind that then stems throughout a number of different systems, but it's ensuring you are who you say you are, kind of in simplicity there. But how employee monitoring would differ is that you're always in the right place at the right time, because you're looking at the source of the activity. When we're talking about an insider that's doing something like committing fraud, or taking data, put on a USB stick, or sending it out via Gmail, or whatever they're doing, you never miss anything because you're always recording at the source. You're always in the right place at the right time. The next thing is that activities are always in context, and that's important. Even with SIM is kind of close to this, because SIM is going to pull from all these different disparate sources, and you're going to try and paint the picture of what it was an employee did, but you really have gaps. You just know that they interacted with this system, then interacted with that system, then interacted with this system, but you don't see the real picture. We get them in context here because you can actually see visually before, during, and after an activity in question to figure out, why did they even do that? What's the context here? Was it malicious intent, or did they have the company in mind, right? The company's best interest. The next thing is that it's anytime, anywhere, in any medium. And because you're watching everything the employee does, like one of the hard spots is always going to be anytime something's done behind or within encryption. And that's probably another good source of security, I would think, especially for data loss. I know I've seen too many stories of laptops being lost. And now we say just encrypt the hard drive, then you have to worry about it. You can just say we didn't lose any records, that the hard drive was encrypted. But if you have like an SSL session on Gmail or Dropbox, someone that's got a network sniffer or they've got firewall logs, they're not going to know what was done over that medium. They just know that something was done. A certain amount of data was passed back and forth or something like that. Same thing with secure FTP. An SSL session is going to throw everything out of whack. But because we're doing this at the source on the employee's computer, we're always at one end of the session. We always get to see what happens there. It's admissible in court. This is something else here, what I'm going to demonstrate to you in a second here. This allows you to take the appropriate action up to and including any kind of legal action if necessary, because you've got records of what it was the person did. How we can help here, there's kind of two products I want to talk about, Spectre 360, and this is company-wide employee monitoring. This is where you really can detect your insider threats because you're looking at it across either a department, an organization, an entire company, and this is a solution for kind of when you know you have problems but you're not sure where they are. And by not sure where they are, I don't mean that you don't even know your high-risk areas. You probably know those, but you're not sure which individuals are problems. So you're going to take more of a broader stance, and you're going to monitor what people are doing and be alerted to the activities that are actually in question, as opposed to watching every keystroke and every application they go into, because that's just too much data. No one cares. The second one is Spectre CNE Investigator. And Spectre CNE Investigator is for more focused investigations. This is for not for when you don't know where you have problems. It's more for when you suspect that Becky in accounts payable is doing something bad, and I want to go drop a piece of software on Becky's machine and record what she's doing and then review it. So there's two flavors here, but I really want to focus in on Spectre 360 because that's kind of the focus here. And what I want to do here is just do a very brief demonstration. We've only got a couple minutes left. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to do just a very, very quick demonstration for you of Spectre 360 so you can see what it's kind of all about. If you look here, what I've got in the foreground here is a definition of client recorder settings. It's what would be recorded on a given machine. If you look down the list that I've got here, you see everything from chat IM activity all the way down to network activity. Go ahead and read the list. You can do it yourself. And we're basically recording every one of these kinds of actions, and you can, if you look to the left, turn them off and on, so you don't have to collect everything if you don't want. And then we collect with that screenshot data that creates a visual record so you can replay what the employee's doing. Now, if I record all that and I was to say, okay, Spectre 360 records all that, and then you just have to go look through it all, you'd say, there's no way I'm doing that. That's too much information. That's like big data in and of itself. I don't want to do that. Just tell me when the things that are inappropriate are happening. So we have two kinds of alerting. One I'll show you, one I'll just talk to. This is keyword-based alerting. I've got just a couple of examples here. And if you look down below the keywords, you'll see in the middle here the different keyword sources where you can scan for those keywords. And the idea here is that no one, even employers, don't want to be big brother over their employees. They want to make sure that their employees have privacy. So they only want to be notified when things that are bad, they need to look at that employee's data. And so utilize these keywords in order to just focus in on not just the one employee, but the one activity of the one employee and focus in there. And then you'll notice at the bottom you can accelerate the screen snapshots to create more of a movie-like quality. The default, by the way, is every 30 seconds. You also can specify to take screen snapshots on operating system events, like when the enter key is pressed or they hit the left mouse button or the title changes in the application window or whatever the case is. And then you see the settings down here at the bottom where you can say something like, I'll take a screenshot every 1 second for the next 2 minutes. And that way you get a really nice visual record. It is important to note, that going back to the issue just of privacy here, that with Spectre 360, one, you have the choice of who you're going to record in the first place, when to record. You also have here what you're going to record. In the issue of like passwords and grabbing, let's say, people's passwords on the internet, because employers don't want your Bank of America password, your Citibank password, right? Nobody wants that. So even something like in keystrokes type, just to show you real quickly, there's the option here of not capturing passwords. And anything that's a web form submit is not captured. That way, the thinking is, if it's not a web form submit, that is, it's a thick application like this, 32-bit, 64-bit application on Windows or something like that, it's probably, on a work computer, it's a work application. It's okay to capture those keystrokes. But if it's a web form submit, it might be Facebook, it might be Bank of America, it might be Citibank. I don't want that. And so we definitely want to give organizations that ability to not capture that. But keep in mind, some organizations use like Salesforce. They will utilize some other SaaS-based application, so they may need to capture that, and so there's the need to maybe check that box as well. And I'll talk about some other privacy settings here in a minute. So once that's all captured, and I forgot to mention the other kind of alerting. Sorry about this, just kind of running off on a tangent. The other kind of alerting besides keyword alerting is activity-based alerting. And it's done based on defining parameters. I used the example early on about like a salesperson printing 50 documents. We might say if somebody prints more than 50 documents, we want to be alerted to that. And that's not keyword-based, that's activity-based. And so there's those kinds of things as well. It could be they go to a certain website. It could be that they run a particular application after hours. Anything like that that's activity-based, you can be alerted on. So the data gets pulled here into an aggregate data into an SQL Server database, and then you're able to look at this data through a dashboard. And all the information that was collected from your Windows and your Mac clients that we put an agent on, as well as BlackBerry devices, I should mention that, all the data is pulled in here. And you can either look at it, if you look at the bottom left here, by the type of data. So if it's email, if it's chat, if it's application data, by user, you can run reports. You can do a search for a keyword. I'm just going to stick with these quick view panels. And I'm going to jump down here to just document tracking. And you'll see the first thing that we're doing here is we're giving you context by letting you compare users with other users. So my example of like the sales guy printing 50 documents, is that abnormal for sales? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You can compare them with their peers and figure it out. But when you see an anomaly like this, where someone's copying a lot of files to removable drives, I can click into that and I can see what data they're actually copying. But then Spectre 360 doesn't stop there. It allows me to go ahead and select that event and view the screen snapshot, and I can actually watch their screen. This is their screen watching them copy the data from one drive. It looks like from a company drive to a removable disk of some kind. And but I still need context, because even this might not be bad. This might be their boss said, hey, copy these over. I'm going to the New York office and I don't have my laptop with me and I need a USB stick. That's why you look before, during, and after an event in question, because you don't want to incriminate somebody because of one action. You want to be able to exonerate them if necessary because of the sum of all their actions. And so if I go forward a little bit here, I see the next thing this employee does is they went over to Yahoo, because remember, we're capturing everything they do, and that's what helps establish the context. And I'll see that they're sending an email out to a Yahoo account called Employee Records and says, attached, please find the employee records you asked for. This isn't looking good. They just copied a bunch of data down. Now they're doing this. What do they do next? Well, it looks like, yeah, they're going to go ahead and attach one of the employee records documents. This is definitely not good. This person's up to no good. And this gives you some context around what they're doing and then why they're doing it and the extent of what was done. If you're only watching USB of copying of data through a DLP solution or something, you might miss the fact they copied something over Yahoo. If this was a Gmail example, I would probably point out, up here in the upper left that, while Yahoo is HTTP, Gmail is HTTPS, this whole thing would never be visible, but it is because we're on one end of that session. So I'm going to kind of just jump back here, because I know we only have a couple more minutes and I want to make sure I have some time for some questions. So let me just quickly summarize, and then Al and I will take some questions here. Insider threats are definitely on the rise. You saw that 250% increase. Detecting data breaches, detecting the insider threats, being able to quickly identify that is going to be critical. Defining the extent is going to be critical, and having context is going to be so important, because even though you might identify someone as a potential threat, you might define some work they've done and the extent of the work they've done, but you don't necessarily have the context around it. You need the context to define whether it was good or bad, and that's important as well. And a good detection strategy is going to minimize those notification costs. I showed you that $188 per record for things like data breaches and so on. So that's going to help as well. And then the last thing here is that user activity monitoring that I showed you here is kind of one of the most sure methods to detect insider threats, including data breaches, because the fact that you're watching everything that the employee does. So if you're of interest, you want to take a look more at Spectre 360, there's a 15-day evaluation of the product. There's also an online test drive where you can run through a couple different scenarios and kind of play with the product in a VM inside of a web browser with no installation necessary. Both those pieces of information both those evaluations are available at SpectorSoft.com. So why don't we go ahead and get into some questions here. I'm going to go ahead and run to some of these. Let me go ahead and grab this box out here. And so one of the questions comes in from TJ, I hope I said your name right. I hope I didn't murder it. Where can I get sample security policies? Actually, in a previous webinar, Alan and I talked about that, and I do have an example of a security policy that I'd be happy to forward over to you, so I'll make sure I email that out to you. If anyone else would like to see a sample security policy, either put something in the question box here or email sales@SpectorSoft.com and ask them to forward it to me, Nick, who did the webinar, and they'll forward it over to me. I'll make sure I get you a copy of that. TG also has a question about, after an internal breach, where do we find legal response requirements for inappropriate internal access of, you mentioned FERPA, which I'm not familiar with, but HIPAA, employee data. I would tell you, like in the case of HIPAA, go to the hhs.gov website, because they would have information around what is required in a response. I would do that. Kevin asks, okay, good question, Kevin. Kevin asks about, can I address the legal aspects brought up on the Spiceworks thread by one of the users, and he actually named the time. I don't have time to go back to that, but I actually read the thread, Kevin, so I know what you're talking about. In the United States, it is, and by the way, let me say it this way. I am not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV, right? But I
stayed a Holiday Inn Express last night.
Yes, exactly. I did, Alan. But I do interact with a lot of customers, and I know customers that are using the software, and so I'm aware of the legal implications. So I will at least preface this with seek your own legal counsel, things like that. So don't take my word as gold, because I'm not an attorney. But in the United States, it is legal. There's no right to privacy for employees on work computers. However, there have been court cases where the employee sued because they had a reasonable expectation to privacy on their work computer, and so they found for the employee because the employer never disclosed that they might be monitored. And case in point, I just showed you the recording of someone's screen. If you had no idea that kind of technology is available, and you're just just some employee working in an accounting department somewhere, you never dreamed that the company could see you typing in your Bank of America password and logging on, right? I would agree with that. So one of the things that we always recommend to our customers is get an acceptable use policy. We have a sample one that we make available on our website, and make sure that it discloses that you have the right, and that the employee should assume that you are monitoring what they do, and you may review their activities or whatever the case is. You don't have to say what solution they're using or the medium by which you're doing it or the methodology or whatever, but that you are going to be monitoring their activities on work computers, on the web, where they go on the web, things like that, so that at least they're aware, and now there's no longer a reasonable expectation of privacy. I hope that answers your question.
So Nick, let me just, I know we don't have a lot of time, but as a non-SpectorSoft employee, let me answer that one as well. Don't blame the tool, right? Don't blame the gun for someone pulling the trigger. Don't blame the tool for someone using it improperly. There is nothing the matter with telling an employee, hey, you're on work computers, on work network. Everything you do can be monitored. We reserve the right to do so. Whether you want to tell them you use SpectorSoft, I don't have a problem telling them.
And taking that even a step further, Alan, the software can be run in stealth. And it also can be run in the open. It can be put right out there saying it's recording what they're doing. And that option is there because some employers want to do that. So there is that as well. So Heath says, Yes, is the risk of threats proportional to how ethical and moral the company's decisions are? I have no idea. I don't have any data on that, so I can't address that one. But he does ask
What was the question?
is the
What
risk
was
of
the
threats
risk?
proportional to how ethical and moral the company's decisions are?
That's a personal decision, and that we're not here to make ethical, what
Yeah, I don't
what
know.
a
I don't know
company's
about that
doing.
even. I don't even any survey data around that either.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of policies can we put in place to prevent data from leaving, especially on mobile devices? I think the first thing is going back to some of the survey data that I had where I was talking about what employees think is okay. And I referenced, again, I don't have the survey exactly in front of me. It is on my blog somewhere that I've got, contextblog.spectorsoft.com. I mentioned it in one of the posts a couple months back. But it was because employers never stated this is unacceptable, right? And I know that sounds stupid because all of us here go, yeah, of course you can't steal sensitive data. It's sensitive data, duh. But maybe people just rationalize. It's quite possible, right? That's part of the fraud triangle. They're just going, well, they never told me I can't, so I'm gonna, which is, of course, very immature and unethical and so on. But I think in some cases it just needs to be said. In the employee handbook or your acceptable use policy or something, you cannot steal company data. So, that would be, one there as well. So let's see. And I'm trying to find, there's a bunch of people that answered your question about people if they have access or not, Alan, so I'm going to, that's funny. Kevin said hello, is someone monitoring this? Yeah, we were just waiting till the end, Kevin. I'm sorry. I should have made that clear. All right, so I'm just run through these questions real quick. I don't have a very big window here. Arlo asks, is this a viable security solution for smaller businesses, less than 50 employees, or is this more or less universal, independent of the size of the organization? How well does it scale? That's a great question. So this kind of solution works for, like Spectre 360 starts at 10 seats. That's normally the size we think people would want to start using. So it requires an SQL Server backend, some dedicated services, that kind of thing. Spectre C&E, it could be run on a workstation. There's no dedicated server necessary. That comes in a 3-pack. So you could go ahead and just do 3 investigations of individuals in your company. As far as scalability, if I remember correctly, the largest deployment we have is 50,000 seats. So it's very, very scalable. So Chuck says, can I install Spectre 360 in my client machines remotely, so I have to go to each machine? Yes, both Windows and Mac. Both can be deployed centrally in stealth. And it's transparent. The only thing will be that because you're having services that need to start, you have to reboot the machine. But usually people say, that's just part of patching, and you do it after hours, leave your machine on tonight, things like that. That can be done, or you just get the machine rebooted. Eric asks about collecting screenshot data and keylogging of cardholder data. How does it affect PCI compliance? So that's a great question, Eric. One of the things that I meant to mention about the privacy of the data comes back into play with where in Spectre 360 on the reviewing side, you can establish roles and who can do what and who can see what data. So the security of the data is very important to us as well. So you have the ability to make sure that just like you have systems in place and security in place to make sure that wherever the cardholder data is is stored, that only certain individuals have access to see it in the first place. In the same way, you can say, well, let's say the boss of all of the people that do key entry, I'm kind of making this up as I go along, let's say there's people taking phone orders. Maybe all they can see is email and application data, which doesn't keep any keystrokes or anything like that. But they can't see screenshots, they can't see keystrokes, and so on.
Nick, from a PCI perspective, though, if you are capturing any PCI sensitive data using SpectorSoft, PCI regulations obviously apply to it, and you need to, follow the 12 steps of PCI, which is to segregate that data, encryption, firewall, etc.
Okay, good point. I appreciate that, Alan. Thanks. Alan asks about how does 360, how do we hide the client? That's a great question. The first thing is the file names are obfuscated, so it doesn't say Spectre 360 service, right? The file names, they're actually put in a folder that's obfuscated as well. It's just a random number of letters and so on. We do put everything in one folder, so if you have antivirus, you can exclude that from your antivirus policies. As far as like a service, it runs again with an obfuscated name. If they stop the service because they have local admin rights or something, we do have a heartbeat that runs. We double check to make sure that it's running. You can be notified that it's not running, but obviously we hope generally that you don't have people having local admin rights on a machine as well. Ryan asked what kind of footprint does the software leave on the system? Will the user notice a lag in performance? Okay, so from a file system standpoint, I think it's about 11 megs total, if I remember correctly. No lag, nothing discernible. The biggest culprit to RAM is going to be the application monitoring. It's about 500K per application open, and that's because we're keeping track and correlating keystrokes, changes in the application, changes in titles, title bars, things like that. All that is being tracked, plus things like active time in the application, how much time is the application in focus in front of the other apps, how much time is it just open. So that's the biggest one here. Carl asks, how is it licensed? It's licensed per seat, per machine being monitored, not per user, per machine. So great question. And then Jared says, is the recording of the software, does it do real-time recording or just the snapshots of different actions? So it's recording as activity happens. The snapshots, again, happen in three kinds of facets. A default of every 30 seconds, which you can modify. Which isn't very helpful, but it's just a catch-all at the end. At least you have that. Then you have based on operating system functionality, and you can establish certain, like if they open an application, if they hit their left mouse button, right mouse button, enter key, control key. So real critical operating system activities, and then keyword-based as well. So that way you try and hone in on the very specific and most important time frames that you really want to get screen snapshots, because those are the biggest culprits of disk space and storage. Vincent says, is it only over corporate network? Does it have a phone home feature? Great question. First thing is if somebody is remote and they're not connected back to the network, so a laptop in a hotel, no connection to the office, it continues running locally, and it just caches that data. There's settings for that. You can specify, if you want to use a fully qualified domain name and you want to open up the ports on your firewall, you could make it run across anywhere on the internet if you want to. You can make it, of course, run only if they're VPN connected or on the corporate network as well. So those are options for you. Ross asks about storage, and we're almost at the end of our time here. I think we've already run a couple minutes over the hour, and I know that we want to give away the iPad mini here in just a minute. So I'll do this question. We'll give away the iPad mini and maybe take just a couple more questions and we'll finish up. But Ross asks how much approximate storage we needed for 360 per user. He asked per month or year. I don't have month or year. I guess you can kind of multiply this out, but the rough average is 8 to 10 megs per user on the average. Depends on what you collect. Again, the biggest culprit is going to be screen snapshots. So the closer you can get to taking screen snapshots just at those critical time frames when those keywords are activated, the better off you are, excuse me. But if not, you have the other types of screen snapshots based on operating system activities or a default fallback position to help you out as there as well. David saw your request to forward security policies. Dar, same thing. And then Peter asked if it needed, can I remote into the computer directly from 360? It's not meant for like a support function, so you don't have any kind of, you can RDP to the machine name, but that's just you doing it yourself, so it's not in there. Let's see, Craig says, knowing how important data is to ISO certification, are there any supports from ISO certification for this software? Not that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean there aren't. I'm not the do-all and be-all, but I'm going to think the educated answer is no. And then, I said we're going to give away the iPad mini. So let's go ahead and really quickly, Abby, who's our iPad mini winner? Let's do that real quick, and then I'll answer a couple more questions and we'll be done.
Great. Yes, so our iPad winner has been randomly chosen, and it is Tim Brandt. So Tim, someone from SpectorSoft will be reaching out to you to get your contact information. Congrats.
And Tim, do me one small favor. If you would, on that thread on the Spiceworks community, someone kind of made a snarky remark that we're never actually going to give away an iPad, I think. I think that's where they're kind of saying, how many Facebook posts have I seen where they don't give them away? Please make sure you post and say you got it, because I'd like people to know that we're a legitimate vendor. We really want to partner with Spiceworks. We're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. We're just trying to provide a service, and and we picked an ad that definitely hit a nerve on everyone, but we're not the bad guys. We're trying to help the good guys. So real quickly, just a couple more questions, and then I do want to respect everyone's time, so I'm going to answer maybe 2 or 3 more. And if we don't get to your question, somebody from sales will be contacting you, and they'll be happy to get the answer for you, so we'll make sure that you do that. Jesse said, what kind of feedback have you seen from hidden monitoring versus out in the open? Most companies like to do it in stealth because they want to see the natural behavior of the employee. Again, if you're trying to detect the insider threat, the individual that's threatening the organization, and you tell them, let's say, I am watching everything you do on that machine, so if you try and steal any of my, let's use PCI, credit card data, right, I will catch you. So what would you do if you knew they were recording everything in it on the screen? You'd pick out your smartphone, you start taking pictures. You just work around the system. So instead, we find that our customers want to use it in stealth so they can see the natural behavior. And then, Pharrell, I hope I said that right, does it automatically alert me if someone's doing something they shouldn't be doing? That goes back to both the keyword and the activity alerting. You set those up, the keywords help identify if they trigger a keyword, they'll say, like, let's use the term again, monster.com, just for someone who's maybe a flight risk. If they trigger monster.com, you're going to be notified they triggered monster.com. You go back, you review what they're doing, you can see they're clearly looking for a job. If it's activity-based alerting, it would say something like they triggered the more than 50 documents printed within an hour, or somebody logged into Salesforce after hours and they shouldn't be normally, that kind of thing. So you will be notified as well. So I really appreciate everyone's time here. We've got I think no more time because we're kind of over by about 9 minutes or so. So I appreciate everyone. Alan, as always, I really appreciate you coming in here and just providing some real-world feedback here, what people are seeing in the industry, because that's very helpful for the community here as well as for us. Just to we live in our own world sometimes, but I love hearing from you and your insight. Thank you for being with me today.
Nick, always a pleasure, and thank you everyone for listening in.
Yeah, so everyone, thanks for attending today. We'll see you on the SpiceWorks community. Make sure you visit Spector360.com, try a free evaluation or a test drive of Spectre 360 if it's of interest to you, and we'll catch you in the next webinar. Thanks for your attendance.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys, and just a reminder to everyone that the webinar was recorded, so you'll get an email in about a week with a link to that. So thanks again for joining our SpiceWorks Partner Webinar. See you on future ones.